Welcome to the deep dive. You shared some really fascinating research earlier about understanding cause and effect from data.
Yeah, it's a huge area trying to figure out the why behind the what just by looking at observations.
Exactly. And you mentioned that a lot of these methods rely on spotting independence, conditional independence.
That's right. It's a really clever approach, actually. You look for situations where knowing one thing doesn't tell you anything new about another thing if you already know a third thing.
Okay, give me a quick example. Make it stick.
All right. Think about DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis.
Right.
DNA holds the blueprint, RNA carries the message, protein gets built.
Standard biology. Got it.
So DNA causes the specific RNA sequence, which in turn causes the specific protein. Now, if you know the exact RNA sequence, does knowing the original DNA sequence tell you anything more about the protein that's going to be built?
Probably not, right?
Yeah.
Because the RNA is the direct messenger. It sort of screens off the DNA's influence on the protein at that point.
Exactly, you got it. DNA and protein become conditionally independent given the RNA. Spotting these kinds of patterns in data helps us map out the likely causal pathways.
Ah, I see. So that's the foundation, these conditional independence or ZI tests.
Precisely. And there are two big ideas here. One is the causal Markov condition, basically. The causal graph implies certain independencies should exist in the data.
Makes sense. Structure dictates statistics.
Right. And the other is faithfulness. This is the assumption going the other way. It says if we see statistical independence in the data under the right conditions, we assume there's no direct causal link in the graph.
So faithfulness is like what you see statistically reflects the underlying causal reality. No hidden connections fooling the test.
You nailed it. But this is where the research you sent over, that April 2025 paper on metadependence, adds a really interesting layer. A complication, maybe?
Okay, intrigued. What's the twist?
Well, the paper argues that assuming perfect faithfulness can be problematic. It points out that in the sort of mathematical space of all possible ways data can be generated.
Distributions that aren't faithful, where independence appears even with a causal link, can be incredibly close to distributions that are faithful.
Close meaning hard to tell apart with real data, with noise and limited samples.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Our real-world data is always just a snapshot. So distinguishing between true faithfulness and something that just looks faithful because of data quirks, well, that can be really tough. It means our discovered causal structure might be unstable.
Unstable how?
Like a tiny change in the data we collect could potentially flip the result of a CI test and maybe change the causal graph we infer.
Okay, that feels important. Our conclusions might be less certain than we think.
Yeah.
So tell me about this metadependence idea then.
Right, so this is the core contribution of the paper. It argues that the different CI tests we run when trying to build a causal model, their outcomes aren't necessarily independent events.
Wait, so the tests themselves are linked? How?
Think about it. We run maybe dozens, even hundreds of these CI tests on a data set, testing if A is independent of C given B, if B is independent of D given A, and so on. Right, building up the picture piece by piece.
Well, the paper suggests that the results of these tests can be statistically dependent. Several tests might be sort of sensitive to the same underlying feature or quirk in the data distribution.
Okay. Like if there's some weird noise pattern, it might affect multiple tests that involve related variables.
Precisely. Or maybe multiple tests are related because they all probe aspects of the same potential causal edge, just with different conditioning sets. If one test suggests removing that edge, maybe others related to it are more likely to suggest the same, or maybe less likely, depending on the specifics. This is metadependence.
Okay, I think I get the concept. Why does understanding this matter so much? What are the implications?
Well, there are a few key things. First, significance thresholds, p-values. If we have a bunch of CI tests and their outcomes are actually dependent on each other, then just applying a standard cutoff, like p0.05, to each test individually might be misleading. We might be over or undercounting the evidence because some tests are essentially echoing each other. Understanding metadependence could help us adjust those thresholds more intelligently.
Right. If 5 tests are telling you roughly the same thing because they're linked, it's not the same as 5 independent pieces of evidence.
Exactly. Second, it affects how we validate our results. Often we compare a discovered causal graph to the true graph, maybe using something like the structural Hamming distance, which just counts edge differences.
Yeah. How many arrows did we get wrong, basically?
But metadependence suggests some errors might be clustered. A small wobble in the data could cause several related edges to be added or removed together. This current way of counting errors doesn't capture that interconnectedness. Some sets of errors might be more understandable given the data limitations than others.
So a single big error versus a cluster of small related errors, they might mean different things about how reliable the overall discovery process was.
That's the idea. And third, it's about uncertainty. We can often estimate the uncertainty for a single CI test, but how confident are we in the whole graph? That's harder. Meta-dependence is key here. If we know how errors in different tests tend to correlate, we can get a much better picture of the overall uncertainty landscape of our discovered causal structure.
Okay, so it helps us understand the structural uncertainty better. Now, the paper mentioned geometric intuition, something about manifolds of independence. It sounds a bit abstract.
It does, but let's try to visualize it. Imagine a huge space representing every possible data distribution for your variables.
Okay, this vast possibility space.
Now, each specific conditional independence statement, like A is independent of C given B, defines a kind of subspace, a surface or manifold within that larger space. Any data distribution that perfectly satisfies that independence rule lies on that specific manifold.
So each potential independence rule carves out its own little zone in this big space.
Exactly. Now, our actual data corresponds to a single point in this space. But because we only have a finite sample, our estimate of that point is a bit fuzzy, like a small cloud rather than a sharp point.
Right. Sampling variation.
Meta-dependence arises from how these different independence manifolds are arranged relative to each other, especially near where our data cloud is located. If two manifolds are geometrically close together near our data, then a small shift in our data estimate, the kind caused by sampling variation, might push us closer to or further away from both manifolds simultaneously. That shared movement, that geometric relationship, is the intuition behind meta-dependence.
Ah, I see. If satisfying one independence geometrically implies getting closer to satisfying another one, given where our data seems to be, then those tests will be meta-dependent.
You've got it. And to make this concrete, they developed a measure called CIMD, Conditional Independence Meta-Dependence.
CIMD. Okay, how does it actually measure this?
It uses a concept from information theory called KL divergence. Basically, KL divergence measures how different one probability distribution is from another reference distribution.
Like, how much information do you lose if you approximate one with the other?
Kind of, yeah. Or how surprising one is if you expected the other. In this context, CIMD uses KL divergence to measure the distance between our actual data distribution and the closest distribution that lies on a specific independence manifold.
So how far are we from perfectly satisfying independence A? How far from perfectly satisfying independence B?
Exactly. Then CIMD looks at what happens to the distance to manifold B if we mathematically project our data onto manifold A. If moving towards satisfying independence A also moves us systematically closer to or further from satisfying independence B, then CIMD will be non-zero, indicating meta-dependence.
So it quantifies that shared movement towards or away from different independence conditions.
Precisely. And the neat thing is, they show how to estimate CIMD using standard statistical methods like maximum likelihood estimators. For Gaussian data, which is common, there's even a direct formula based on the covariance matrix. Makes it practical.
Practical is good.
Okay.
Okay, so they had the CIMD measure. The paper gave examples of positive and negative dependence using some equations. Can you walk through those?
Sure, let's take a simple chain. A causes B, B causes C. So A, B, E, C. In this setup, A and C should be independent given B, but they are dependent otherwise.
Right.
Now, imagine the strength of the AB link is a bit uncertain in our data. The paper shows, like in their equation 4 setup, that if a fluctuation makes the AB link look weaker, it might also make the overall AC relationship look weaker, potentially pushing us towards incorrectly concluding A and C are independent without conditioning on B.
Ah, so a wobble affecting the AB test also affects the AC test in the same direction, both moving towards appearing independent.
Exactly. That's positive meta-dependence. The tendencies to make errors, like violating faithfulness on related tests, are correlated.
Okay, what about negative dependence?
That was a slightly different setup they showed. Equation 5. There, depending on the specific numbers, the strengths of the connections, you could have a situation where a change in the data makes it more likely you'd find, say, A independent of C, but less likely you'd find B independent of C. The effects push in opposite directions for different tests.
Wow. Okay, so getting one wrong might actually nudge another related test towards being right, or vice versa. That's counterintuitive.
It really is. And it drives home a key point. Meta-dependence isn't just about the arrows in the graph. It depends heavily on the parameters, the actual strengths of those causal effects in the underlying data generating process. The same structure can have different meta-dependence patterns.
That really highlights how subtle causal discovery can be. It's not just structure, it's the quantitative details too. Now, how did they connect CIMD to, the real world uncertainty we face? They mentioned FSCID.
Right, FSCID, finite sample CI dependence. This is more empirical. They used bootstrapping, basically, resampling their data with replacement many times to create slightly different data sets.
Simulating what happens if you collect slightly different data samples.
Exactly. Then, on each bootstrapped sample, they run the CI tests and see how often two specific tests both come out as significant, for example, suggesting independence when maybe there isn't any, or vice versa. FSCID measures this co-occurrence rate across the bootstraps.
So it's a data-driven way to see how test results fluctuate together because of sampling randomness.
Precisely. And the crucial step was comparing their theoretical CIMD measure to this empirical FSCID measure. They did this on synthetic data where they knew the ground truth, and also on real data sets. California housing prices, health data from wearables like Apple Watch and Fitbit, and car MPG data.
Did the theory match the practice?
Largely, yes. They found that CIMD, especially a version they called CIMD lim that accounts for situations where independence is already very clearly true or false, showed patterns very similar to FSCAD.
So the way CIMD predicted tests would be positively or negatively dependent, mirrored how they actually behave together in the bootstrapped real-world and synthetic data.
That's what they found. For example, in the synthetic data plots, like their figure 1, the regions where CIMD predicted positive or negative dependence lined up well with where FSCID showed positive or negative co-occurrence. And in the real data, like the Apple Watch Fitbit set, they found consistent meta-dependencies involving variables like height, weight, steps, heart rate, appearing in both the CIMD calculations and the FSCID results.
That's pretty strong validation, isn't it? I mean, CIMD isn't just a theoretical curiosity. It seems to capture something real about how these tests behave with finite data.
Exactly. It suggests CIMD could be genuinely useful.
Useful how? What are the practical takeaways or future directions here?
Well, as we touched on, potentially more intelligent ways to set significance thresholds in causal discovery algorithms.
Yeah.
Knowing which tests are likely to move together could lead to more reliable structures.
Adjusting for the echo chamber effect among tests.
Kind of, yeah. It could also help explain why some causal structures seem harder to learn reliably than others. Maybe they involve strong meta-dependencies that make them very sensitive to data fluctuations.
Makes sense.
The researchers also floated the idea of moving towards confidence ensembles of causal graphs. Instead of just one best-guess graph, you might generate a set of plausible graphs, where the relationship between them reflects the meta-dependencies identified by CIMD.
So a richer picture of uncertainty, showing not just if we're uncertain, but how different plausible structures relate to each other.
That's the potential. And another practical point they made is that CIMD can often be computed from summary statistics, like a covariance matrix, or from a generative model if you have one.
Meaning you don't always need the raw data.
Right. Which is great for privacy-sensitive situations or massive data sets where sharing raw data isn't feasible. You could still analyze the meta-dependent structure.
Okay, so this research really gives us a deeper, more connected view. It's not just about individual tests, but the system of tests and how they interact based on the underlying data.
Absolutely. It feels like a really important step towards making causal discovery methods more robust, more reliable, and ultimately more trustworthy.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, a proper deep dive into some complex but really crucial ideas. For me, the big takeaway is definitely that these conditional independence tests, which are the workhorses of causal discovery, they aren't isolated players.
Yeah, they influence each other.
Right. This meta-dependence shows how they're interconnected, and understanding that gives us a much better handle on how stable and reliable our causal findings really are. It really hits home that the specifics of the data matter hugely.
It absolutely does, and it leads to a good question for everyone listening. Thinking about your own field or data you work with, how might this idea that statistical tests for causal links aren't independent change how you interpret results or design analyses?
Definitely food for thought. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty, the math, and the full experiments, the paper itself is 2504.12594v1.pdf. It's worth exploring how CIMD might apply to your own data challenges. It feels like this kind of understanding is paving the way for more solid causal inference down the line. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.